Okay, so this is a follow-up talk from what was done previously, which is on the RSS YouTube channel, and there will be links on this one when it goes up to that one and vice versa. But that was given by Bradley Monton, who is an American philosopher over here on sabbatical. So this is sort of a follow-up, semi-response, but putting the scientific perspective from a scientist rather than a philosopher. So, me, creation and intelligent design. My kind of journey starts with this guy here in the middle, John Luxstrober, who's a young Earth creationist, thinks that the Earth is the centre of the universe and the sun revolves around it. And friend Patrick, who's a computer programmer, but he really loves philosophy and history and arguing for the sake of arguing. So they've been friends all the way through high school. And so when they met me in my undergrad, Patrick delighted in being able to start an argument between myself and John repeatedly until eventually I was like, listen, I've had enough of this. You haven't studied the science. You've got to go away and do that and then come back. I'm sick of giving a remedial science lesson to you that you promptly forget as soon as you walk out the door. And then Patrick pointed out that the same could be said true for me. Like I hadn't gone and studied what the creationists were saying, so how do I know that John wasn't just giving a really crappy rendition of something that was actually proper? And I was like, oh, okay, fair enough. Make you a deal, John. I'll go do that if you go learn science. We shook on it. I did that. John didn't. And so now I don't get to talk to John anymore, although he still starts arguments on a regular basis. The last one was last Tuesday after the Star Trek episode, movie. But it wasn't a complete waste of time because I do have to deal with that on a regular basis with the undergrads. And it's got to the point now where I can identify which particular creationist outfit put forward a particular idea. And this one you would have all seen at the beginning of the year whizzing around the internet. I took one look at this and went, answers in Genesis. I didn't know it came from the Blue Ridge Christian Academy, but question 18 pretty much gave it away like a fingerprint. And then when intelligent design became popular, I just continued on and read up on that. So that's my background for this particular subject. So a small disclaimer, this is mainly for Talia. I probably like the black cat meme a little more than I should, but I've got a great deal of respect for philosophy. It's fantastic for structuring an argument and everything, but it seems to me that it's more focused on whether the argument is cogent and clear, while science tends to go, well, the argument sounds utterly retarded, but that's what the evidence says. And just looking into things like quantum physics gives you an example of that. So I'm putting at this from what the evidence is and what the reality is, rather than the previous speaker, I think it was coming from a purely idealized philosophical standpoint. Bradley made quite a few points. I'm not going to bother going through all of those because this is not supposed to be a complete refutation rather than the other side. But his main thrust was you can't treat the intelligent design, these sophisticated individuals as he called them, like creationists. And after all, the creationists do some pretty ridiculous things, ranging from dishonest tactics, misrepresenting what the science say, refusing to look at the evidence, claiming that the overwhelming evidence is not enough, making claims that cannot be falsified, keeping on making claims that have been falsified, and using political pressure instead of peer review to try to get their message into the schoolroom. But the main points I'll be responding to were, in this approximate order, was whether or not the demands of explanation are met by atheists or not, science naturalism, can we falsify a designer? I think that's a pretty important one. Whether or not intelligent design is inherently theistic, and does that matter? But the main thing is, all the way through his talk, he downplayed the evolution of intelligent design from creation science. That's the first half of the talk. Then we're going to look at the good arguments for design and whether or not students would benefit from studying intelligent design in high school. As for the good arguments, I'm only going to focus on the first two because that's what falls within biology. Outside that, it becomes chemistry, cosmology, and then just pure philosophy, which I feel like the simulation argument definitely is. So demands for explanation not met by atheists. This was the sort of was mentioned several times, but I kind of objected to the entire thing because atheists don't have to do anything. Science and atheism are not interchangeable terms. This is scientists, which includes some very devout religious individuals like Ken Miller, who was in the Dover trial, and Sir Francis Collins, who headed the Human Genome Project, who are very religious and say the same arguments that I do. So this is mainstream science versus some extremely religious individuals. But even if that was the case, atheists don't have to do anything in terms of if we don't have a natural explanation for anything, doesn't mean a religious assertion wins by default. And he said that that's a card atheists have to be willing to play, and said that people get upset about that, but scientists and atheists regularly say, we don't know. I don't know is a perfectly reasonable answer, and it's said quite a lot. Anyway, so what is science? Well, he's correct, there is no real clear definition of what science is. But then again, there's not a clear definition for a lot of things like species and colour, and this is because most things in nature form into a continuum. They're not discrete, but we like thinking of things in discrete boxes. So really, you can say, where does red turn into orange? And different people will tell you different numbers or what their perception is, but that doesn't mean you get to claim that something that's blue is red. So, but as a general rule, people tend to, at least in the field, tend to approach science from having these sort of characteristics. First of all, a theory that matches the observed evidence. And we saw that in the talk last week, where Einstein's theory of relativity, when he came up with it originally, didn't match the steady state universe we thought we lived in. So he had to change it to match it, rather than ignoring that major point, hence the cosmological constant. It's got to have predictive power. Newton's theory, as mentioned in the previous talk, as being a false theory. This isn't quite right. If we're shooting for perfection, then there is no such thing as science, period. Science isn't about perfection, it's about close approximations, and you can still predict where the planets are going to be using Newton's theory. Plus, a lot of it was incorporated into Einstein's. It's got to make new testable predictions that hypothetically can be falsified. Maybe not everything, but the majority of it should be able to. And finally, the main thing that is a hallmark of science is that it changes to match what the incoming data is, not the other way around. So when we're talking about intelligent design, we should be measuring up against something like this. Well, at least that's the spot that I'm coming from. As for naturalism, this is a viewpoint that thinks that natural laws are what controls everything. You don't have a supernatural entity running in and screwing with stuff, or aliens or anything else. And we need this sort of assumption to be made, otherwise you can't say, or actually build on the existing knowledge, because you don't know if your results is because of the whim of a third party that you don't even know whether they're there or not. And this is a base assumption. But as naturalism. But we'll hold the questions until the end, because I'm on a tight thing. I'll give you the microphone then. But then science is not the search for truth, apparently. But I disagree with that. If we were to take a look at something like drug trials, and we've got 2 sets of cancer drugs, there's more than these individuals in it, and you apply those drugs, and inevitably you end up losing some out of the trials. Now, the naturalists may have no reason or understanding of why there was a difference between the 2 drugs. They just know that it didn't work. A supernatural explanation that would explain more, apparently, would be that it was just their time or was some part of some divine plan. Now, this is clearly ridiculous, and those that believe in the supernatural don't subscribe to this either, but this is an extreme example. And if it's not okay to do this here, why is it okay to insert something elsewhere? So I think science is the search for truth, but it's the search for truth we can apply a degree of certainty to, not just a possible truth that is asserted. Bradley brought up an extraordinary evidence situation, which was star signaling. Basically, a star would signal to us how to unlock the answers of physics, claiming that it was God. And when he was doing that example, it made me remember about a certain Star Trek episode where Adria turned up from this planet and said, I'm here to claim the planet. 1,000 years ago you made a deal with me. I'm now here to collect. And then she proceeded to perform a whole lot of prophesized miracles. When Picard and co turned up, she turned into Satan in the Klingon version, said, look, I'm known by many names and I'm here. Now, obviously the supernatural explanation is possible to be at least plausible in this particular instance, like the star signaling. But this isn't actual science going out and testing stuff. This is like direct communication with an active entity. And by the end of the episode, you find out that she's just an alien with some really advanced technology. But I agree, in this sort of extraordinary instance, that sort of thing should be on the table, but that doesn't mean that it is. What we get instead are prayer studies. They were mentioned in the previous talk as well, but he got one thing slightly wrong. They don't always give the null result. They've done prayer studies and they found that there is a difference between those that prayed for and those that aren't, and it was a negative difference. Those who were being prayed for did worse than those that were being prayed for. Now, do we take in the supernatural explanation that they're being punished for being prayed for, or is this possibly more of a psychological effect that, oh my God, I've got professional prayers praying for me, freak out? Clearly, the naturalistic explanation is something else. So if you get a null experiment, maybe it was because they wasn't part of the plan for them to be made well. Really, you can't disprove that sort of idea. And that's, I think, the central thing is that with the studies that we have in the real world, we're limited to naturalistic tools, and trying to stretch that into the supernatural realm, if it does exist, you're going a bridge too far. That's not something that we can do. We can only say whether or not the effect is occurring in the real world. So far, no. On to the falsification. A concept, I can think of actually a falsifiable concept of design that's occurring right now in labs around the world, and that's synthetic biology. This is a step up from actual genetic engineering. They're still having to use organisms that we currently have, but they're squishing them together. There's no reason to suspect that in the future we won't be able to actually make them from scratch, atom by atom. But under this concept or design, a little crazy North Korean manages to kick off World War III. There's a thermonuclear war and everything's wiped out. And we're just left with no life on Earth except for what's hanging out in these fridges. And then one or more of them fall over and the organisms spill out. And they recolonize the planet, become multicellular, eventually developing science, and they ask the question, where did we come from? Are we designed? Now for them, the answer is clearly yes, and it's also clearly falsifiable because they will have the fridges and the society that we left behind there to show that we were there, and if this model wasn't true, they wouldn't find that stuff. So I do think some concepts of design may actually be falsifiable. But this isn't what we're getting told. When we talk about intelligent design and what the intelligent design movement is putting forward, they're putting forward some vague claim that there's a designer. Now, if there is a designer, I can think of 3 reasons why we wouldn't see any evidence for it. One is that the designer didn't want to be detected. If we're talking about some super powerful or a super advanced entity, it could quite easily come down and remove all evidence of it ever being there. Or it could be that the resulting designs are indistinguishable from natural processes. Or, just to be even more confusing, the designer could use natural processes to create these supposedly designed things. So if there's no designer, if this is indistinguishable from if there is a design on one of these 3 things that are occurring. Therefore, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Therefore, this sort of hypothesis can't be disproved, and therefore the current iteration of intelligent design is not science. Now, when you talk about falsification, this came up on the previous Facebook discussion, and this was fired off at me, which is, and I've underlined the too literally part here. It's from a philosophy textbook. There could be more examples that invalidate, but this is all I got. But it says here that if we take Popper too literally, insisting that theories are only scientific if they're falsifiable, we lead to inconsistent conclusions, and perfectly reasonable scientific statements like the impossibility of perpetual motion machines cannot be falsified. The cosmological search for dark matter cannot be falsified. I completely disagree with this. If all you need to do is get yourself a perpetual motion machine. Now, no, actually I don't, because here's the next bit. Because when I brought this up, he said, well, how long do you have to watch it for? Not very long. You don't have to watch it for eternity. Most of science is about approximation. If we were limited to actually watching things that occur only in our lifespan, then we wouldn't get anything done. But if you would sit this perpetual motion machine down, watch it for a day, a year, whatever, make sure that it doesn't slow down and that no energy is entering into the system, you've disproved the idea that they're impossible. Or at least put some very strong evidence towards it. And this doesn't mean that you get to teach the controversy until you do that. As for the existence of dark matter, the talk last week showed quite clearly that it's there. We're now looking to see what sort of nature that it may have. Again, if you show that those calculations and everything are wrong, then dark matter goes out the window. So the current claim of that there's a designer cannot be falsified. So we're slowly knocking down one by one the things that creationists do. But the concept of design was originally put forward by William Paley in 1803. Well, again, at least in any sort of cogent idea. But his argument was if you're walking along the beach and you find a pocket watch, and you've never come across a pocket watch before, or any one from the Western Hemisphere, and you pick it up, you know what it is immediately, that it's something that is designed. Maybe not what it's for, but if you open up the back, there's a whole lot of working parts. These parts mesh together. Take any of them out, it doesn't work. Similarly, same thing is we said for an eye, wings of a bird, and there are many other examples that have been put forward over the years. And because if you remove any one of these parts, they stop working. And then Darwin popped along a few years later and showed quite clearly that there was a continuous gradient, that there was a way for these things to occur. You start with a level of, for the eye, a level of photosynthetic cells. You can tell light from dark, becomes a cup. You can tell direction. The cup gets deeper and deeper and the sides bend over. And you end up with a pinhole camera. Then a very basic eye with a reflective lens to actually sharpen up the image until you get the complicated one in an octopus. He did it in a lot more detail than this and specified species all along this chain. Similarly, if you were to throw a chicken and a person off the roof of this building, neither of these things can actually fly, but the chicken's probably going to land okay, but the person's going to get severely injured. And so too with the bombardier beetle, you have a weak solution becoming stronger. Now, the Discovery Institute is the current forerunners in arguing for design. So who are they and what's it all about? Well, they were started by Philip E. Johnson. He was a Berkeley Law professor and became a born-again Christian while he was tenured. And is an outstanding critic of what he calls Darwinism, so scientific materialism. He's accredited with establishing the wedge strategy, and he's also a member of the group for the scientific reappraisal of the HIV hypothesis. He thinks that AIDS is caused by immoral behaviour, drugs, sex outside of marriage. Since they have feline AIDS with the same type of virus, I can only conclude that we've got some really bad kitties out there. Michael Behe is the main poster child for it. He's the one who coined the term irreducible complexity, and he asserts that some biochemical structures are too complex to be explained by known evolutionary mechanisms. He's currently at Lee University and he's got a PhD. Jonathan Wells is a member of the Unification Church. He is the one that does the junk DNA. The Unification Church are affectionately referred to as Moonies because they believe that some young moon is the reincarnation of Jesus, and if you're not married by him, you're not married, so they're quite famous for having very large mass weddings. But it was his conversations with Father, as he calls them, that convinced him to devote his life to destroying Darwinism. He's actually got 2 PhDs, one from Yale in theology and the other one from Berkeley in molecular and cell biology. Now, what about the genetic fallacy? I agree that we should not reject intelligent design because it's advocated exclusively by the super religious and, as it turned out from the last time, the Raelians. But I do think it's important to know where the claims are coming from, and we should be sceptical of their claims to be approaching this fairly and honestly. And if they start with a preconceived position that they're not willing to give up, they're not really interested in doing science rather than promoting that position. And if this is simply rebranded creationism, then we've already heard, analysed and dismissed the argument because it's a bad argument, not because it's a bad a religious one. Religious arguments can be right. As for it being inherently theistic, I think this is a bit of a cheap trick because you can actually find people who believe that Jesus did the miracles that he did and he's an alien. There's 7 billion of us, chances are some nutcase is going to think that aliens are involved with whatever you want to talk about. It doesn't suddenly suddenly make it a non-theistic claim. And after all, it's not the aliens who are putting things like the wedge strategy in place. These are the two goals stated at the front of the wedge strategy. You can find it on the internet very easily, just Google it. It's to defeat scientific materialism and its destructive moral and cultural legacies, and replace it with the understanding that nature and human beings were created by God. Now, the Discovery Institute says they don't say who the designer is, but it's quite clear who they think the designer is. Now, all this evidence was presented to Judge Jones in the Dover trial in Pennsylvania. He heard a lot of the scientific arguments and also the linking of the intelligent design to creation science. The biggest bit of evidence they put forward on that front was of Panda and People, which is written in part by Dembski and Wells, who are both Discovery Institute individuals, and two young Earth creationists, one of which was involved in the 1987 case, which kicked creationism out of the schools. Now, the Centre for Science Research did a subpoena and got all the previous versions of Pandas and People. Now, if you look at along the bottom here, it starts off with creation biology in 1983, and it goes through to pandas in, 1983, and goes through to pandas in 1993. And they did a word search for intelligent design in blue, which starts at the bottom on the left, goes up to the top on the right, and creation on S, so it's got all the different versions of that. And in 1987, there was two versions of Pandas and People where the term suddenly flicked. And when Judge Jones was shown this, one of his eyebrows popped up. He was quite surprised, because that marked the spot where that court case came through that said you cannot teach creationism in schools because it's breaking the First Amendment clause.
Clarification, what on the...
This is the word count. That's the number of words.
Count of those words.
Word count of those words.
Okay, cool.
Prior to going into the Dover trial, Behe claimed that he would bet a case of good scotch that Judge Jones was going to side with him because he's a Bush conservative Republican federal judge appointee who goes to church every Sunday with his wife, so there was no way he'd vote against them. But all against them he did because of evidence like this and evidence showing that the argument for reducible complexity was not true. In fact, if you go into the actual text of the book, you can see the same set of text here, and all they did was a lazy copy-paste because they replaced the word creationist on the top block of text with C design proponents, and there's a little bit of a screw-up here. So you can actually buy this T-shirt because this is the missing link showing that this book evolved into the other one. So this is an attempt by creationism to get into the school via the claiming it, rebranding itself as something different. And the Discovery Institute was also heavily involved in the Ben Stein film documenting this entire thing, where they interviewed a whole lot of evolutionary biologists, but actually did it underneath a different title and quote mined and cut everything out of context. And this is what they now show to various members of Congress to try to actually get intelligent design taken seriously. So we've got them using political pressure instead of peer review to get in there, and also dishonest tactics to get their message through. But I agree that none of that matters if it's the argument that's important. So I'm going to look at the first two. Let's look at the irreducible complexity argument. Remember the original argument from design? Design remove any one of these parts? Well, this is exactly the same thing that Behe is saying, except for he's put a sophisticated term for it, irreducibly complex. His argument is if you take any one of the parts away, the flagellum stops working, and there's no earlier iterations of this that would make any sense or have any sort of function. So therefore, it's irreducibly complex, therefore it's designed. But this is the problem with this argument. It's only looking at the addition of additional parts onto something to have an effect. Sorry, for evolution. And Quasi-Soup kind of stole my thunder on this one because there's other things that occur. Sometimes evolution subtracts, sometimes it substitutes, and there's also the change of function. And by ignoring these three other parts, Behe is missing the entire point. And if you look at the bacterial flagellum, this is it here on the left, marked A. If you take away half of the parts, you still have something that's functional. This is the type 3 excretory system of bacteria. Now, when this came out and was shown, Behe then fired back going, oh, well, no, actually, it subtracted down into this. So now he's suddenly remembered the fact that evolution takes away. And he could be right. Maybe A did become B. But the fact remains that A is not irreducibly complex by definition. But they're still pushing it because it's quite easy to explain to somebody how wings could develop or the eye. But this micro level is quite complicated with a whole lot of specialized proteins, and it's easy to confuse the public with that. So they're still making this claim, so they keep on making claims that have been falsified. Now, this could just be a bad example, and there could be other examples of falsification. And in the trial, they brought up blood clotting factors in the immune system. But the plaintiffs, the parents of the school board, who included Christians, by the way, who sued it, were ready for them because they'd read Behe's book. And the lawyer came out and showed Behe a paper after he made the statement that there's no evidence for the evolution of the immune system. You can get the court transcript online, by the way. And he said, well, have you seen this paper? Have you read this paper? No, I haven't. But that's just one paper. That's not enough evidence. And he put it down, went back, pulled out another paper. What about this paper? Same response. What about this book chapter, this book? And slowly stacked them up on the book in front of Behe and said, well, what about all that? He goes, well, that's simply not enough evidence for me. Which is both the strength and the weakness of the intelligent, this irreducibly complex argument. It's like playing whack-a-mole. So he have him refusing to look at the evidence when it's given, and the claim that the overwhelming evidence that's present is not enough. So I just have to show them misrepresenting the science, and I've completed the set. One of the other things that was brought up was unintelligent design. And here's two things that occur: ectopic pregnancies in females, hernias in males, both because we've got a crappily designed reproductive system. But the point still remains, just because it's intelligent design doesn't mean that it has to be perfect. And that's fair enough. But this is sort of like the Patriot Act. It says one thing, but then is another. And if you're going to claim that something's intelligent design, at least you should show signs of intelligence, be consistent, and not downright retarded. For example, in terms of the consistency, if you look at the human eye and all the other vertebrate eyes, we've got a blind spot in the back. The way the eye gets around it is by jiggling. The octopus eye doesn't have that. No one's been able to come up with a rationale why it is, except for the fact they did evolve 2 times, and one time it just happened to be the evolutionary path just led it to being something that wasn't quite right. If you look at we know we have common descent from things like genetics or homology, but one of the coolest ones is this term called avidisms, where you have things like birds have the genes for feathers, nothing else does. But birds also have the genes for teeth, even though they don't have feathers. Similarly, mammals only have the genes for nipples, and so on. You have this branching pattern that is the same pattern over and over again. And similarly, the problem with the eye, similarly with the eye, you have the same thing, that all animals in very different environments have that hole in the back for no apparent reason. And we don't have anything like the crocoduck, which is regularly mentioned, not by the Discovery Institute on my mind. This is by someone who's clearly got no brains at all. We need something like Gonzo to turn up to throw this entire tree out of way. So where would you put him? Through things that make absolutely no sense from an engineering perspective, like the rabbit, for example, its fermentation chamber, the cecum, is at the wrong end. So it actually has to eat the grass, goes to the cecum, it ferments, it poops out the pellets, then it turns around and it eats the pellets to digest the food. Like, what sort of intelligence or engineer would design that? It works perfectly fine, it just really doesn't make any sense. But it does in an evolutionary perspective, because Monty Python was right, rabbits did used to be carnivorous way back in the past. Anyway, so that's why I find the irreducible complexity / intelligent design thing not so good. But let's look about the no junk DNA argument. Okay, DNA crash course for non-biologists. You've got 21 essential amino acids in your system that make up all the proteins. And you need to have a stop command when you're transcribing these to say, okay, stop the protein here. So that means you need 22 codes, but you've got a problem. There's only 4 DNA bases, adenine, thymine, thymine, and guanine. So you've got to have them in sets. 4 times 4 is 16. You're still short of the 22. But in sets of 3, 4 times 4 times 4, 64, you've now got enough codes. Incidentally, I'm wondering whether this is where Douglas Adams got the meaning of life being 42 from, because there's a redundancy of 42 in the genetic code. Reading the codes look like this. So basically, the first base pair is on the left-hand column, second base is on the top, and then you've got the third base down the side. And you'll notice that a lot of the time you can change quite a few of the letters, and you code for exactly the same thing. These are known as neutral mutations. So how you can get a mutation in a genome and not actually change the function. Also, less commonly, with the amino acids, when you get them in the wrong chain, they then turn over and fold in to make a 3-dimensional structure. If you replace one amino acid with another amino acid, which has similar products and doesn't affect the way that protein folds, you end up with the same functional protein, although that isn't as common. So to get your proteins, it works like this. You have biological activity on the cell where RNA polymerase attaches to the DNA, and you've also got repressor proteins which stop the transcription. So basically the cell at the top one is trying to transcribe the lactose enzyme that breaks down the lactose, called lactase, and it's stopped by the repressor protein. When you get the lactose is actually present, it'll block the repressor protein, the RNA polymerase comes across, and you end up with your messenger RNA popping out. And that's at stage 1 here. Then it goes out of the cell, goes into the ribosome, gets read, and out pops the polypeptide. That's basically how it works. So what is junk DNA? Junk DNA is, according to evolutionary theory, is bits of DNA that are either defunct genes or insertions. And you get these things called microsatellites, which keep asserting there's something with the code when it transcribes that it'll repeat 2 base pairs. It happens quite a lot. It's how we use genotyping. But the idea, but this is put out in the popular press, as most of it is a complete waste. It doesn't have any function. It's there for nothing. And you've really got to understand the science cycle, which starts with someone putting a conclusion in a paper with a whole lot of caveats on it, and it quite quickly getting dropped by the news cycle until it's completely misrepresented by your grandmother. I've had this. Or Zach. Anyway, anywho, this could probably be summed up a little bit better with this. Now, I've had personal experience with this with the New Zealand Herald. They rang me up for my master's research. We had a conversation. It was going to be a filler piece because it wasn't breaking news or anything like that. And it would be written by the end of the day and be out in a couple of weeks. I was like, awesome. Can I take a look at it then? Just to make sure I've communicated it clearly to you and you to me. Well, we wouldn't do that for the Pope. I don't get your point. Well, the Pope's an important person. It's like, look, I just want to make sure that I got my story straight to you and the reader's going to get the story straight. She's like, no, that's what the retraction section's for. And that's really what it comes down to, is the popular press wants to sell papers. We want to communicate, and there's a definite problem there. But anywho. So this is a preface from Wells's book on junk DNA, where he cites Miller and Francis Collins along with a whole lot of other individuals who actually have written papers saying this section of the genome doesn't have junk DNA in it. And he's flicking it around to claim that they're not willing to follow the science, as is his last line here. So what are the actual claims? Well, according to popular press, 80 to 90% of the thing does not actually code for anything. Wells says it's 0%, or very much close to it. He does acknowledge things like the vitamin C gene not working, but it's actually not junk to him. It's just a broken bit of code. And the uncode thing, which is what comes out, which is the supposedly proving the thing, shows 20% shows no biological activity. Now, when this came out with the previous speaker, we made eye contact when he said Wells was proved correct. And I shook my head very slowly, and he was like, well, that's maybe a little too strong. We do know that there is junk DNA, and we can prove this through a number of different ways. First of all, you can cut out large sections of DNA, no effect. You can replace those with randomized sequences, no effect. Some bits of DNA we know are corrupted copies of encoding functional DNA from gene duplication, and so it doesn't matter if they come or go. You've got that hierarchical system we've got. Some close relations have genomes way larger than their close relations. No possible reason for it other than mutation. It's not like they've got extra bits they need to be encoded for. And the mutations of the functional regions of DNA show evidence of selection. Remember that neutral stuff? Some bits don't change because they can't. They're important. You need them. Other bits do. And you can look at all the reference for this on talkorigins.org. Anyway, junk DNA can actually be useful. You've got this thing called crossing over when you make eggs or sperm. Bits of the chromosomes switch positions. And it's thought that some important genes need to have the junk DNA between them to make sure they don't get pulled apart. Similarly, it gives you somewhere to actually have the break occur. This is in a DNA textbook that came out in 1994. So maybe junk DNA itself, just being there, is useful. But none of this really matters because that ENCODE group has been pulled apart quite strongly in the literature by genome biology and evolution with one of the most harshest things. I didn't think they were allowed to put this into an actual paper. This is not the work of scientists, this is the work of a group of badly trained technicians. The main thing is, what Code was saying, is that we have biological activity. And these guys' main thrust, they had several things, but the main thing was biological activity is not equal to function. You can just have sections of the DNA that happens to have things binding to it. You've got to actually show function. And if you think that I'm stretching it, one of the authors, this is from his blog, you can look him up, he actually acknowledges that 20% was probably a better line, but 80% shows that there was some sort of biological activity in here. And the perfect purpose for ENCODE was to getting a database that you could start trawling through and looking for that function. So the popular press has gone and taken this out of context, blown up to say that we don't have junk DNA anymore, when really we do. But there's probably a lot more of it in there that actually codes with things. So this is probably a slightly better summary of it. 20% is likely functional, 6% has biological activity, but we need to check that for function before flying off the handle. So the no junk DNA argument is not only wrong, but also overinflated. But you can't blame Wells for that. However, there are some other things that he's done quite blatantly. First of all, he's claimed things that there's never been any new species evolved. You can go back to Talk Origins and show that we've actually observed this occur both in the field and in the lab. He does, in his previous book, Icons of Evolution, he does a bait and switch with Haeckel's embryos. Haeckel thought that there was some purpose to things being here and we're all marching towards some higher life form. And if Haeckel was right, then Darwin was wrong. But he does a bait and switch. A lot of people did use Haeckel's embryos in their textbooks and they shouldn't be, but there we go. With the Urey-Miller experiments, he only reports on half of them and makes the claim that ancient Earth used to have oxygen. But if you've got any oxygen in the atmosphere, it binds to iron pretty quickly. There'd only ever be trace amounts. But his most egregious one that I've ever come across from Wells was the claim that the bird-hip dinosaurs only had individuals like T-Rex, that there were no little dinosaurs, and there's no way T-Rex could evolve to fly with his little arms, ignoring all the other bird-hip dinosaurs that are present and fossils that are present. So we've got them misrepresenting the science too. So if they're going to create the same sins of the creationists, and they're using the same argument of the creationists, I think Barbara Forrest, who was criticised at the beginning of the last talk, was well within their right when she's talking to the popular people, not actually the philosophy majors, to characterise them the way she did. So, the conclusion on intelligent design is it is nothing more than rehashed creationism. Irreducible complexity fails at both the example and the principle level, and the junk DNA argument is actually overinflated and incorrect. ID still doesn't have any predictive power, and I think this all completely puts a stop to science, because would Wells and Co. be looking for the type 2 executing system and whether it worked? I don't think so. But as for proof that I need, some sort of actual code in the DNA would be interesting, like some sort of prime numbers. There's no reason why that would be there in terms of sets. An evolutionary history giving us something like a crocoduck, or something that only would make sense using an ID model. Maybe I got trademark stamped across of everything may be a bit too much, but I'd settle for something like cows with continents, or, you know, rather than just the occasional random cat fur that looks like the word cat. But anyway, can't we use this as an example in the high school level? This is the text from the sticker that they tried putting on the actual biology book. This textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things, and this material should be approached with an open, carefully studied mind and critically considered. This was read out to Kenneth Miller, who said, well, knew that the reporter who was trying to get a soundbite off him was baiting him. He said, no, I don't think it goes far enough. I think you need to have this. This textbook contains material on science. Science is built around theories which are strongly supported by factual evidence. Everything in science should be approached with an open mind and studied carefully and critically considered. Because this first one, by implication, by singling out evolution, says that the rest of it's fine, don't worry about it. And that's horseshit. The entire thing needs to be critically considered and carefully studied. So I don't think we should teach both sides, because why are we doing it just for evolution? If you're going to do it for one thing, then you should be applying it to the rest. Do we want to really do that for the Earth shape, the Holocaust, Civil War, physics versus magic, or astronomy? No. High school students aren't ready to actually sit down at this level. They need to be given the best information that we've currently got. Because it's not the ideal environment that Bradley was arguing from. And this is just an example of the sort of stuff that occurs in schools.
The law as it stands requires Joe Wilkie to teach evolution only, but it's a struggle. The young people of Dayton hold tightly to their belief in the Bible. Unable to deny the word of God to his students or himself, Joe Wilkie walks a thin line between science and religion.
Creationists like to be lumpers. They like to put a lot of organisms together in a group. Evolutionists like to be splitters. They like to set off a whole bunch of different organisms. An evolutionist says that there's natural reproductive boundaries out there that prohibit dogs, wolves, coyotes, foxes from reproducing.
I believe that I give the evolutionary view equal time, and I believe I give it a fair shake. I believe I give the creation view a fair shake.
Wait a minute, you don't even think it's a theory?
Well, I mean, it's not really, basically it's not been proven. We had to be put here, some supernatural thing. We couldn't have evolved from such a simple organism into what we are now. There's no way, the way that they think that it all started.
How could I say to a student, your ideas are trash, keep them out of this room, I don't want to hear them. We don't want to discuss that. Don't you know you're being one of those hick hillbillies believing all that religious stuff? How could I say that to a student and look that student in the eye the next day and say, I respect you as a person?
We didn't evolve from anything. That doesn't make any sense. How can an African American person evolve from a white person? We're different skin.
Now, obviously, it doesn't help with the accent, but the problem, main thing is, if you're going to add something in, you're going to have to take something out. This is the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We aren't teaching this anymore in New Zealand. I was taught it in high school. We now have to teach it for the first time in stage 1. And
What, the Roman, the red and the white, and the Roman colour? They don't teach that.
they don't teach this formula and how to work it out. Right? The law says that you have to plan for certain things, but there's nothing about running out of time. You can do that. You just have it in your lesson plan, and things can go as you plan. So if we let intelligent design in, currently the unifying theory of biology can be put at the end of the course. It's like teaching students about chemistry and not teaching them about atoms. So if we put intelligent design in, we're going to have to take something else out. but then we're also giving them the opportunity to teach the intelligent design side and then run out of time for evolution. And I don't think that guy was giving it a fair shake, as he thinks. Those kids definitely had a total misunderstanding of what was going on. So anyway.
Can we have time for break?
Yep. Oh yeah, I study bats. Hence Batman's reference.